This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 61. Within the gentle heart, love shelters him, as birds within the green shade of the grove. Before the gentle heart, in nature's scheme, love was not, nor the gentle heart ere love. Guido Gunicelli, Rossetti's translation. There was another house besides the White House at Pennicote, another breast besides Rex Gascoigne's, in which the news of Grandcourt's death caused both strong agitation and the effort to repress it. It was Hans Meyrick's habit to send or bring in the Times for his mother's reading. She was a great reader of news, from the widest-reaching politics to the list of marriages. The latter, she said, giving her the pleasant sense of finishing the fashionable novels without having read them, and seeing the heroes and heroines happy without knowing what poor creatures they were. On a Wednesday there were reasons why Hans always chose to bring the paper, and to do so about the time that Myra had nearly ended giving Mab her weekly lesson, avowing that he came then because he wanted to hear Myra sing. But on the particular Wednesday now in question, after entering the house as quietly as usual with his latch-key, he reappeared in the parlor, shaking the Times aloft with a crackling noise, in remorseless interruption of Mab's attempt to render Lascia ciao pianga with a remote imitation of her teacher. Piano and song ceased immediately. Myra, who had been playing the accompaniment, involuntarily started up and turned round, the crackling sound, after the occasional trick of sound, having seemed to her something thunderous. And Mab said, "Oh, Hans, why do you bring a more horrible noise than my singing?" "What on earth is the wonderful news?" said Mrs. Meyrick, who was the only other person in the room. "Anything about Italy? Anything about the Austrians giving up Venice?" "Nothing about Italy, but something from Italy," said Hans, with a peculiarity in his tone and manner which set his mother interpreting. Imagine how some of us feel and behave when an event, not disagreeable, seems to be confirming and carrying out our private constructions. We say, "What do you think?" in a pregnant tone to some innocent person who has not embarked his wisdom in the same boat with ours, and finds our information flat. "Nothing bad," said Mrs. Meyrick anxiously, thinking immediately of Deronda, and Myra's heart had been already clutched by the same thought. "Not bad for anybody we care much about," said Hans quickly. "Rather uncommonly lucky, I think. I never knew anybody die conveniently before. Considering what a dear gazelle I am constantly wondering to find myself alive." "Oh me, Hans," said Mab impatiently. "If you must talk of yourself, let it be behind your own back. What is it that has happened?" "Duke Alfonso is drowned, and the Duchess is alive, that's all," said Hans, putting the paper before Mrs. Meyrick with his finger against a paragraph. "But more than all is, Deronda was at Genoa in the same hotel with them, and he saw her brought in by the fishermen who had got her out of the water time enough to save her from any harm. It seems they saw her jump in after her husband, which was a less judicious action than I should have expected of the Duchess. However, Deronda is a lucky fellow in being there to take care of her." Myra had sunk on the music-stool again with her eyelids down and her hands tightly clasped, and Mrs. Meyrick, giving up the paper to Mab, said, "Poor thing, she must have been fond of her husband to jump in after him." "It was an inadvertence, a little absence of mind," said Hans, creasing his face roguishly and throwing himself into a chair not far from Myra. "Who can be fond of a jealous baritone with freezing glances, always singing asides? That was the husband's role, depend upon it. Nothing can be neater than his getting drowned. The Duchess is at liberty now to marry a man with a fine head of hair and glances that will melt instead of freezing her. And I shall be invited to the wedding." Here Myra started from her sitting posture, and fixing her eyes on Hans with an angry gleam in them, she said in a deeply shaken voice of indignation, "Mr. Hans, you ought not to speak in that way. Mr. Deronda would not like you to speak so. Why will you say he is lucky? Why will you use words of that sort about life and death, when what is life to one is death to another? How do you know it would be lucky if he loved Mrs. Grandcourt? It might be a great evil to him. She would take him away from my brother. I know she would. Mr. Deronda would not call that lucky to pierce my brother's heart." All three were struck with the sudden transformation. Mirah's face, with a look of anger that might have suited Ithuriel, pale even to the lips that were usually so rich of tint, was not far from poor Hans, who sat transfixed, blushing under it as if he had been a girl, while he said nervously, "I am a fool and a brute, and I withdraw every word. I'll go in and hang myself like Judas, if it's allowable to mention him." Even in Hans's sorrowful moments his improvised words had inevitably some drollery. But Mirah's anger was not appeased. How could it be? She had burst into indignant speech as creatures in intense pain bite and make their teeth meet even through their own flesh, by way of making their agony bearable. She said no more, but seating herself at the piano, pressed the sheet of music before her, as if she thought of beginning to play again. It was Mab who spoke, while Mrs. Meyrick's face seemed to reflect some of Hans's discomfort. "Myra is quite right to scold you, Hans. You are always taking Mr. Deronda's name in vain. And it is horrible, joking in that way about his marrying Mrs. Grandcourt. Men's minds must be very black, I think," ended Mab with much scorn. "Quite true, my dear," said Hans in a low tone, rising and turning on his heel to walk toward the back window. "We had better go on, Mab. You have not given your full time to the lesson," said Mirah in a higher tone than usual. "Will you sing this again, or shall I sing it to you?" "Oh, please sing it to me," said Mab, rejoiced to take no more notice of what had happened. And Mirah immediately sang Lasciao ciao panga, giving forth its melodious sobs and cries with new fullness and energy. Hans paused in his walk and leaned against the mantelpiece, keeping his eyes carefully away from his mother's. When Mirah had sung her last note and touched the last chord, she rose and said, "I must go home now. Ezra expects me." She gave her hand silently to Mrs. Meyrick and hung back a little, not daring to look at her, instead of kissing her as usual. But the little mother drew Mirah's face down to hers and said soothingly, "God bless you, my dear." Mirah felt that she had committed an offense against Mrs. Meyrick by angrily rebuking Hans, and mixed with the rest of her suffering was the sense that she had shown something like a proud ingratitude, an unbecoming assertion of superiority. And her friend had divined this compunction. Meanwhile Hans had seized his wide awake and was ready to open the door. "Now, Hans," said Mab, with what was really a sister's tenderness cunningly disguised, "you are not going to walk home with Mirah. I am sure she would rather not. You're so dreadfully disagreeable to-day." "I shall go to take care of her, if she does not forbid me," said Hans, opening the door. Mirah said nothing, and when he had opened the outer door for her and closed it behind him, he walked by her side unforbidden. She had not the courage to begin speaking to him again, conscious that she had perhaps been unbecomingly severe in her words to him, yet finding only severer words behind them in her heart. Besides, she was pressed upon by a crowd of thoughts thrusting themselves forward as interpreters of that consciousness which still remained unaltered to herself. Hans on his side had a mind equally busy. Mirah's anger had waked in him a new perception, and with it the unpleasant sense that he was a dolt not to have had it before. Suppose Mirah's heart were entirely preoccupied with Deronda, in another character than that of her own and her brother's benefactor? The supposition was attended in Hans's mind with anxieties which, to do him justice, were not altogether selfish. He had a strong persuasion, which only direct evidence to the contrary could have dissipated, and that was that there was a serious attachment between Deronda and Mrs. Grandcourt. He had pieced together many fragments of observation, completed by what his sisters had heard from Anna Gascoigne, which convinced him not only that Mrs. Grandcourt had a passion for Deronda, but also, notwithstanding his friend's austere self-repression, that Deronda's susceptibility about her was the sign of concealed love. Some men, having such a conviction, would have avoided allusions that could have roused that susceptibility. But Hans's talk naturally fluttered toward mischief, and he was given to a form of experiment on live animals which consisted in irritating his friends playfully. His experiments had ended in satisfying him that what he thought likely was true. On the other hand, any susceptibility Deronda had manifested about a lover's attentions being shown to Mirah, Hans took to be sufficiently accounted for by the alleged reason, namely her dependent position; for he credited his friend with all possible unselfish anxiety for those whom he could rescue and protect. And Deronda's insistence that Mirah would never marry one who was not a Jew necessarily seemed to exclude himself, since Hans shared the ordinary opinion, which he knew nothing to disturb, that Deronda was the son of Sir Hugo Mallinger. Thus he felt himself in clearness about the state of Deronda's affections. But now the events which really struck him as concurring toward the desirable union with Mrs. Grandcourt had called forth a flash of revelation from Mirah, a betrayal of her passionate feeling on this subject, which had made him melancholy on her account as well as his own, yet on the whole less melancholy than if he had imagined Deronda's hopes fixed on her. It is not sublime, but it is common, for a man to see the beloved object unhappy because his rival loves another, with more fortitude and a milder jealousy than if he saw her entirely happy in his rival. At least it was so with the mercurial Hans, who fluctuated between the contradictory states of feeling, wounded because Mirah was wounded, and of being almost obliged to Deronda for loving somebody else. It was impossible for him to give Mirah any direct sign of the way in which he had understood her anger, yet he longed that his speechless companionship should be eloquent in a tender, penitent sympathy, which is an admissible form of wooing a bruised heart. Thus the two went side by side in a companionship that yet seemed an agitated communication, like that of two chords whose quick vibrations lie outside our hearing. But when they reached the door of Mirah's home, and Hans said "Good-bye," putting out his hand with an appealing look of penitence, she met the look with melancholy gentleness, and said, "Will you not come in and see my brother?" Hans could not but interpret this invitation as a sign of pardon. He had not enough understanding of what Mirah's nature had been wrought into by her early experience to divine how the very strength of her late excitement had made it pass more quickly into the resolute acceptance of pain. When he had said, "If you will let me," and they went in together, half his grief was gone, and he was spinning a little romance of how his devotion might make him indispensable to Mirah in proportion as Deronda gave his devotion elsewhere. This was quite fair, since his friend was provided for according to his own heart. And on the question of Judaism Hans felt thoroughly fortified. Who ever heard in tale or history that a woman's love went in the track of her race and religion? Moslem and Jewish damsels were always attracted toward Christians, and now if Mirah's heart had gone forth too precipitately toward Deronda, here was another case in point. Hans was wont to make merry with his own arguments, to call himself a Giaour, and antithesis the sole clue to events. But he believed a little in what he laughed at, and thus his bird-like hope, constructed on the lightest principles, soared again in spite of heavy circumstances. They found Mordecai looking singularly happy, holding a closed letter in his hand, his eyes glowing with a quiet triumph which in his emaciated face gave the idea of a conquest over assailing death. After the greeting between him and Hans, Mirah put her arm round her brother's neck, and looked down at the letter in his hand without the courage to ask about it, though she felt sure that it was the cause of his happiness. "A letter from Daniel Deronda," said Mordecai, answering her look. "Brief, only saying that he hopes soon to return. Unexpected claims have detained him. The promise of seeing him again is like the bow in the cloud to me," continued Mordecai, looking at Hans. "And to you it must be a gladness, for who has two friends like him?" While Hans was answering, Mirah slipped away to her own room, but not to indulge in any outburst of the passion within her. If the angels, once supposed to watch the toilette of women, had entered the little chamber with her and let her shut the door behind them, they would only have seen her take off her hat, sit down and press her hands against her temples as if she had suddenly reflected that her head ached, then rise to dash cold water on her eyes and brow and hair till her backward curls were full of crystal beads, while she had dried her brow and looked out like a freshly opened flower from among the dewy tresses of the woodland, then give deep sighs of relief, and putting on her little slippers, sit still after that action for a couple of minutes, which seemed to her so long, so full of things to come, that she rose with an air of recollection and went down to make tea. Something of the old life had returned. She had been used to remember that she must learn her part, must go to rehearsal, must act and sing in the evening, must hide her feelings from her father, and the more painful her life grew, the more she had been used to hide. The force of her nature had long found its chief action in resolute endurance, and to-day the violence of feeling which had caused the first jet of anger had quickly transformed itself into a steady facing of trouble, the well-known companion of her young years. But while she moved about and spoke as usual, a close observer might have discerned a difference between this apparent calm, which was the effect of restraining energy, and the sweet genuine calm of the months when she first felt a return of her infantine happiness. Those who have been indulged by fortune, and have always thought of calamity as what happens to others, feel a blind incredulous rage at the reversal of their lot, and half believe that their wild cries will alter the course of the storm. Mirah felt no such surprise when familiar sorrow came back from brief absence, and sat down with her according to the old use and wont. And this habit of expecting trouble rather than joy hindered her from having any persistent belief in opposition to the probabilities which were not merely suggested by Hans, but were supported by her own private knowledge and long-growing presentiment. An attachment between Deronda and Mrs. Grandcourt, to end in their future marriage, had the aspect of a certainty for her feeling. There had been no fault in him. Facts had ordered themselves so that there was a tie between him and this woman who belonged to another world than hers and Ezra's, nay, who seemed another sort of being than Deronda, something foreign that would be a disturbance in his life instead of blending with it. Well, well, but if it could have been deferred so as to make no difference while Ezra was there. She did not know all the momentousness of the relation between Deronda and her brother, but she had seen and instinctively felt enough to forebode its being incongruous with any close tie to Mrs. Grandcourt. At least this was the clothing that Mirah first gave to her mortal repugnance. But in the still, quick action of her consciousness, thoughts went on like changing states of sensation unbroken by her habitual acts. And this inward language soon said distinctly that the mortal repugnance would remain, even if Ezra were secured from loss. What I have read about and sung about and seen acted is happening to me. This that I am feeling is the love that makes jealousy. So impartially Mirah summed up the charge against herself. But what difference could this pain of hers make to any one else? It must remain as exclusively her own and hidden as her early yearning and devotion to her lost mother. But unlike that devotion, it was something that she felt to be a misfortune of her nature, a discovery that what should have been pure gratitude and reverence had sunk into selfish pain, that the feeling she had hitherto delighted to pour out in words was degraded into something she was ashamed to betray, an absurd longing that she who had received all and given nothing should be of importance where she was of no importance, an angry feeling toward another woman who possessed the good she wanted. But what notion, what vain reliance could it be that had lain darkly within her and was now burning itself into sight as disappointment and jealousy? It was as if her soul had been steeped in poisonous passion by forgotten dreams of deep sleep, and now flamed out in this unaccountable misery. For with her waking reason she had never entertained what seemed the wildly unfitting thought that Deronda could love her. The uneasiness she had felt before had been comparatively vague, and easily explained as part of a general regret that he was only a visitant in her and her brother's world, from which the world where his home lay was as different as a portico with lights and lackeys was different from the door of a tent, where the only splendor came from the mysterious, inaccessible stars. But her feeling was no longer vague. The cause of her pain, the image of Mrs. Grandcourt by Deronda's side, drawing him farther and farther into the distance, was as definite as pincers on her flesh. In the psyche mold of Mirah's frame there rested a fervid quality of emotion, sometimes rashly supposed to require the bulk of a Cleopatra. Her impressions had the thoroughness and tenacity that give to the first selection of passionate feeling the character of a lifelong faithfulness. And now a selection had declared itself, which gave love a cruel heart of jealousy. She had been used to a strong repugnance toward certain objects that surrounded her, and to walk inwardly aloof from them while they touched her sense. And now her repugnance concentrated itself on Mrs. Grandcourt, of whom she involuntarily conceived more evil than she knew. "I could bear everything that used to be, but this is worse, this is worse. I used not to have horrible feelings," said the poor child in a loud whisper to her pillow. Strange that she should have to pray against any feeling which concerned Deronda. But this conclusion had been reached through an evening spent in attention to Mordecai, whose exaltation of spirit in the prospect of seeing his friend again disposed him to utter many thoughts aloud to Myra, though such communication was often interrupted by intervals apparently filled with an inward utterance that animated his eyes and gave an occasional silent action to his lips. One thought especially occupied him. "Seest thou, Myra," he said once after a long silence, "the Shema wherein we briefly confess the divine unity is the chief devotional exercise of the Hebrew, and this made our religion the fundamental religion for the whole world. For the divine unity embraced as its consequence the ultimate unity of mankind. See, then, the nation which has been scoffed at for its separateness has given a binding theory to the human race. Now, in complete unity, a part possesses the whole as the whole possesses every part. And in this way human life is tending toward the image of the supreme unity. For as our life becomes more spiritual by capacity of thought and joy therein, possession tends to become more universal, being independent of gross material contact, so that in a brief day the soul of man may know in fuller volume the good which has been and is, nay, is to come, than all he could possess in a whole life where he had to follow the creeping paths of the senses. In this moment, my sister, I hold the joy of another's future within me, a future which these eyes will not see, and which my spirit may not then recognize as mine. I recognize it now, and love it so that I can lay down this poor life upon its altar and say, 'Burn, burn indiscernibly into that which shall be, which is my love, and not me.' Dost thou understand, Myra?" "A little," said Myra faintly, "but my mind is too poor to have felt it." "And yet," said Mordecai rather insistently, "women are specially framed for the love which feels possession in renouncing, and is thus a fit image of what I mean. Somewhere in the later Midrash, I think, is the story of a Jewish maiden who loved a Gentile king so well that this was what she did. She entered into prison and changed clothes with the woman who was beloved by the king, that she might deliver that woman from death by dying in her stead, and leave the king to be happy in his love which was not for her. This is the surpassing love that loses self in the object of love." "No, Ezra, no," said Myra with low-toned intensity. "That was not it. She wanted the king when she was dead to know what she had done, and feel that she was better than the other. It was her strong self, wanting to conquer, that made her die." Mordecai was silent a little, and then argued, "That might be, Myra, but if she acted so, believing the king would never know." "You can make the story so in your mind, Ezra, because you are great, and like to fancy the greatest that could be.
But I think it was not really like that. The Jewish girl must have had jealousy in her heart, and she wanted somehow to have the first place in the king's mind. That is what she would die for. My sister, thou hast read too many plays, where the writers delight in showing the human passions as indwelling demons, unmixed with the relenting and devout elements of the soul. Thou judgest by the plays, and not by thy own heart, which is like our mother's." Myra made no answer. End of chapter 61.
This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 62.
Das Glück ist eine leichte Dirne und weilt nicht gern am selben Ort. Sie streicht das Haar dir von der Stirn und küsst dich rasch und flattert fort. Frau Unglück hat im Gegenteil dich liebefest ans Herz gedrückt. Sie sagt, sie habe keine Eile, setzt sich zu dir ans Bett und stricht. From Heine.
Something which Myra had lately been watching for as the fulfillment of a threat seemed now the continued visit of that familiar sorrow which had lately come back, bringing abundant luggage. Turning out of Knightsbridge, after singing at a charitable morning concert in a wealthy house, where she had been recommended by Klesmer, and where there had been the usual groups outside to see the departing company, she began to feel herself dogged by footsteps that kept an even pace with her own. Her concert dress being simple black, over which she had thrown a dust cloak, could not make her an object of unpleasant attention, and render walking an imprudence, but this reflection did not occur to Myra. Another kind of alarm lay uppermost in her mind. She immediately thought of her father, and could no more look round than if she had felt herself tracked by a ghost. To turn and face him would be voluntarily to meet the rush of emotions which beforehand seemed intolerable. If it were her father, he must mean to claim recognition, and he would oblige her to face him. She must wait for that compulsion. She walked on, not quickening her pace, of what use was that, but picturing what was about to happen as if she had the full certainty that the man behind her was her father. And along with her picturing went a regret that she had given her word to Mrs. Meyrick not to use any concealment about him. The regret at last urged her, at least, to try and hinder any sudden betrayal that would cause her brother an unnecessary shock. Under the pressure of this motive, she resolved to turn before she reached her own door, and firmly will the encounter instead of merely submitting to it. She had already reached the entrance of the small square where her home lay, and had made up her mind to turn, when she felt her embodied presentiment getting closer to her, then slipping to her side, grasping her wrist, and saying with a persuasive curl of accent, "Myra!" She paused at once without any start. It was the voice she expected, and she was meeting the expected eyes. Her face was as grave as if she had been looking at her executioner, while his was adjusted to the intention of soothing and propitiating her. Once a handsome face, with bright color, it was now sallow and deep-lined, and had that peculiar impress of impudent suavity which comes from courting favor while accepting disrespect. He was lightly made and active, with something of youth about him which made the signs of age seem a disguise, and in reality he was hardly 57. His dress was shabby, as when she had seen him before. The presence of this unreverend father now more than ever affected Myra with the mingled anguish of shame and grief, repulsion and pity, more than ever, now that her own world was changed into one where there was no comradeship to fence him from scorn and contempt. Slowly, with a sad, tremulous voice, she said,
"It is you, father." "Why did you run away from me, child?" he began with rapid speech, which was meant to have a tone of tender remonstrance, accompanied with various quick gestures like an abbreviated finger language. "What were you afraid of? You knew I never made you do anything against your will. It was for your sake I broke up your engagement in the Vorstadt, because I saw it didn't suit you, and you repaid me by leaving me to the bad times that came in consequence. I had made an easier engagement for you at the Vorstadt Theater in Dresden. I didn't tell you because I wanted to take you by surprise, and you left me planted there, obliged to make myself scarce because I had broken contract. That was hard lines for me, after I had given up everything for the sake of getting you an education which was to be a fortune to you. What father devoted himself to his daughter more than I did to you? You know how I bore that disappointment in your voice and made the best of it. And when I had nobody besides you, and was getting broken, as a man must who has to fight his way with his brains, you chose that time to leave me. Who else was it you owed everything to, if not to me? And where was your feeling in return? For what my daughter cared, I might have died in a ditch." Lapidoth stopped short here, not from lack of invention, but because he had reached a pathetic climax, and gave a sudden sob like a woman's, taking out hastily an old yellow silk handkerchief. He really felt that his daughter had treated him ill, a sort of sensibility which is naturally strong in unscrupulous persons, who put down what is owing to them, without any per contra. Myra, in spite of that sob, had energy enough not to let him suppose that he deceived her. She answered more firmly, though it was the first time she had ever used accusing words to him. "You know why I left you, father, and I had reason to distrust you, because I felt sure that you had deceived my mother. If I could have trusted you, I would have stayed with you and worked for you." "I never meant to deceive your mother, Myra," said Lapidoth, putting back his handkerchief, but beginning with a voice that seemed to struggle against further sobbing. "I meant to take you back to her, but chances hindered me just at the time, and then there came information of her death. It was better for you that I should stay where I was, and your brother could take care of himself. Nobody had any claim on me but you. I had word of your mother's death from a particular friend who had undertaken to manage things for me, and I sent him over money to pay expenses. There's one chance to be sure." Lapidoth had quickly conceived that he must guard against something unlikely yet possible. "He may have written me lies for the sake of getting the money out of me." Myra made no answer. She could not bear to utter the only true one, "I don't believe a word of what you say." And she simply showed a wish that they should walk on, feeling that their standing still might draw down unpleasant notice. Even as they walked along, their companionship might well have made a passer-by turn back to look at them. The figure of Myra, with her beauty set off by the quiet, careful dress of an English lady, made a strange pendant to this shabby, foreign-looking, eager, and gesticulating man, who withal had an ineffaceable jauntiness of air, perhaps due to the bushy curls of his grizzled hair, the smallness of his hands and feet, and his light walk. "You seem to have done well for yourself, Myra. You are in no want, I see," said the father, looking at her with emphatic examination. "Good friends who found me in distress have helped me to get work," said Myra, hardly knowing what she actually said, from being occupied with what she would presently have to say. "I give lessons. I have sung in private houses. I have just been singing at a private concert." She paused, and then added with significance, "I have very good friends who know all about me." "And you would be ashamed they should see your father in this plight? No wonder. I came to England with no prospect but the chance of finding you. It was a mad quest, but a father's heart is superstitious, feels a lodestone drawing it somewhere or other. I might have done very well staying abroad. When I hadn't you to take care of, I could have rolled or settled as easily as a ball. But it's hard being alone in the world, when your spirit's beginning to break. And I thought my little Myra would repent leaving her father when she came to look back. I've had a sharp pinch to work my way. I don't know what I shall come down to next. Talents like mine are no use in this country. When a man's getting out at elbows, nobody will believe in him. I couldn't get any decent employ with my appearance. I've been obliged to get pretty low for a shilling already." Mirah's anxiety was quick enough to imagine her father's sinking into a further degradation, which she was bound to hinder if she could. But before she could answer his string of inventive sentences, delivered with as much glibness as if they had been learned by rote, he added promptly, "Where do you live, Myra?" "Here, in this square. We are not far from the house." "In lodgings?" "Yes." "Any one to take care of you?" "Yes," said Myra again, looking full at the keen face which was turned toward hers. "My brother." The father's eyelids fluttered as if the lightning had come across them, and there was a slight movement of the shoulders, but he said, after a just perceptible pause, "Ezra? How do you know? How did you find him?" "That would take long to tell. Here we are at the door. My brother would not wish me to close it on you." Myra was already on the doorstep, but had her face turned toward her father, who stood below her on the pavement. Her heart had begun to beat faster with the prospect of what was coming in the presence of Ezra, and already in this attitude of giving leave to the father whom she had been used to obey, in this sight of him standing below her, with a perceptible shrinking from the admission which she had been indirectly asking for, she had a pang of the peculiar sympathetic humiliation and shame, the stabbed heart of reverence which belongs to a nature intensely filial. "Stay a minute, Liebchen," said Lapidoth, speaking in a lowered tone. "What sort of man has Ezra turned out?" "A good man, a wonderful man," said Myra, with slow emphasis, trying to master the agitation which made her voice more tremulous as she went on. She felt urged to prepare her father for the complete penetration of himself which awaited him. "But he was very poor when my friends found him for me, a poor workman. Once, 12 years ago, he was strong and happy, going to the East, which he loved to think of, and my mother called him back because she had lost me, and he went to her and took care of her through great trouble and worked for her till she died in grief. And Ezra too had lost his health and strength. The cold had seized him coming back to my mother because she was forsaken. For years he has been getting weaker, always poor, always working, but full of knowledge and great-minded. All who come near him honor him. To stand before him is like standing before a prophet of God." Myra ended with difficulty, her heart throbbing. "Falsehoods are no use." She had cast down her eyes that she might not see her father while she spoke the last words, unable to bear the ignoble look of frustration that gathered in his face. But he was none the less quick in invention and decision. "Myra, Liebchen," he said in the old caressing way, "shouldn't you like me to make myself a little more respectable before my son sees me? If I had a little sum of money, I could fit myself out and come home to you as your father ought, and then I could offer myself for some decent place. With a good shirt and coat on my back, people would be glad enough to have me. I could offer myself for a courier, if I didn't look like a broken-down mountebank. I should like to be with my children, and forget and forgive. But you have never seen your father look like this before. If you had £10 at hand, or I could appoint you to bring it me somewhere, I could fit myself out by the day after tomorrow." Myra felt herself under a temptation which she must try to overcome. She answered, obliging herself to look at him again, "I don't like to deny what you ask, father, but I have given a promise not to do things for you in secret. It is hard to see you looking needy, but we will bear that for a little while, and then you can have new clothes, and we can pay for them." Her practical sense made her see now what was Mrs. Meyrick's wisdom in exacting a promise from her. Lapidoth's good humor gave way a little. He said with a sneer, "You are a hard and fast young lady. You have been learning useful virtues, keeping promises not to help your father with £1 or 2 when you are getting money to dress yourself up in silk. Your father, who made an idol of you and gave up the best part of his life to providing for you." "It seems cruel. I know it seems cruel," said Myra. feeling this a worse moment than when she had meant to drown herself. Her lips were suddenly pale. "But, father, it is more cruel to break the promises people trust in. That broke my mother's heart. It has broken Ezra's life. You and I must eat now this bitterness from what has been. Bear it. Bear to come in and be cared for as you are." "Tomorrow, then," said Lapidoth, almost turning on his heel away from this pale, trembling daughter, who seemed now to have got the inconvenient world to back her. But he quickly turned on it again, with his hands feeling about restlessly in his pockets, and said, with some return to his appealing tone, "I'm a little cut up with all this, Myra. I shall get up my spirits by tomorrow. If you've a little money in your pocket, I suppose it isn't against your promise to give me a trifle to buy a cigar with?"
Myra could not ask herself another question, could not do anything else than put her cold, trembling hands in her pocket for her porte-monnaie and hold it out. Lapidoth grasped it at once, pressed her fingers the while, and said, "Good-bye, my little girl. To-morrow, then," and left her. He had not taken many steps before he looked carefully into all the folds of the purse, found 2 half-sovereigns and odd silver, and pasted against the folding cover a bit of paper on which Ezra had inscribed in a beautiful Hebrew character the name of his mother, the days of her birth, marriage, and death, and the prayer, "May Myra be delivered from evil." It was Myra's liking to have this little inscription on many articles that she used. The father read it, and had a quick vision of his marriage day, and the bright, unblamed young fellow he was at that time, teaching many things, but expecting by and by to get money more easily by writing, and very fond of his beautiful bride Sarah, crying when she expected him to cry, and reflecting every phase of her feeling with mimetic susceptibility. Lapidoth had traveled a long way from that young self, and thought of all that this inscription signified with an unemotional memory, which was like the ocular perception of a touch to one who has lost the sense of touch, or like morsels on an untasting palate, having shape and grain, but no flavor. Among the things we may gamble away in a lazy, selfish life is the capacity for truth, compunction, or any unselfish regret, which we may come to long for as one in slow death longs to feel laceration, rather than be conscious of a widening margin where consciousness once was. Myra's purse was a handsome one, a gift to her, which she had been unable to reflect about giving away, and Lapidoth presently found himself outside of his reverie, considering what the purse would fetch in addition to the sum it contained, and what prospect there was of his being able to get more from his daughter without submitting to adopt a penitential form of life under the eyes of that formidable son. On such a subject his susceptibilities were still lively. Meanwhile Myra had entered the house with her power of reticence overcome by the cruelty of her pain. She found her brother quietly reading and sifting old manuscripts of his own, which he meant to consign to Deronda. In the reaction from the long effort to master herself, she fell down before him and clasped his knees, sobbing and crying, "Ezra, Ezra!" He did not speak. His alarm for her spending itself on conceiving the cause of her distress, the more striking from the novelty in her of this violent manifestation. But Myra's own longing was to be able to speak and tell him the cause. Presently she raised her hand, and still sobbing, said brokenly, "Ezra, my father, our father, he followed me. I wanted him to come in. I said you would let him come in, and he said no, he would not now, but tomorrow, and he begged for money from me, and I gave him my purse, and he went away." Myra's words seemed to herself to express all the misery she felt in them. Her brother found them less grievous than all his preconceptions, and said gently, "Wait for calm, Myra, and then tell me all," putting off her hat and laying his hands tenderly on her head. She felt the soothing influence, and in a few minutes told him as exactly as she could all that had happened. "He will not come tomorrow," said Mordecai. Neither of them said to the other what they both thought, namely, that he might watch for Myra's outgoings and beg from her again.
"Seest thou," he presently added, "our lot is the lot of Israel. The grief and the glory are mingled as the smoke and the flame. It is because we children have inherited the good that we feel the evil. These things are wedded for us, as our father was wedded to our mother." The surroundings were of Brompton, but the voice might have come from a rabbi transmitting the sentences of an elder time to be registered in Babli, by which to our ears, affectionate-sounding diminutive, is meant the voluminous Babylonian Talmud. "The omnipresent," said a rabbi, "is occupied in making marriages." The levity of the saying lies in the ear of him who hears it, for by marriages the speaker meant all the wondrous combinations of the universe whose issue makes our good and evil. End of chapter 62.
This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 63.
Moses, trotz seiner Befeindung der Kunst, dennoch selber ein großer Künstler war und einen wahren Künstlergeist besaß. Nur war dieser Künstlergeist bei ihm, wobei seinen ägyptischen Landsleute, nur auf das Kolossale und Unverwüstliche gerichtet. Aber nicht wie die Ägypter formierte er seine Künstlerwerke aus Backstein und Granit, sondern er baute Menschenpyramiden, er meißelte Menschenobelisken, er nahm einen armen Hirtenstamm und schuf daraus ein Volk, das ebenfalls den Jahrhunderten trotzen sollte. Er schuf Israel. From Heines Geständnisse.
Imagine the difference in Deronda's state of mind when he left England and when he returned to it. He had set out for Genoa in total uncertainty how far the actual bent of his wishes and affections would be encouraged, how far the claims revealed to him might draw him into new paths, far away from the tracks his thoughts had lately been pursuing with a consent of desire which uncertainty made dangerous. He came back with something like a discovered charter warranting the inherited right that his ambition had begun to yearn for. He came back with what was better than freedom, with a duteous bond which his experience had been preparing him to accept gladly, even if it had been attended with no promise of satisfying a secret passionate longing never yet allowed to grow into a hope. But now he dared avow to himself the hidden selection of his love. Since the hour when he left the house at Chelsea in full-hearted silence under the effect of Myra's farewell look and words, their exquisite appealingness stirring in him that deep-laid care for womanhood, which had begun when his own lip was like a girl's. Her hold on his feeling had helped him to be blameless in word and deed under the difficult circumstances we know of. There seemed no likelihood that he could ever woo this creature who had become dear to him amidst associations that forbade wooing. Yet she had taken her place in his soul as a beloved type, reducing the power of other fascination, and making a difference in it that became deficiency. The influence had been continually strengthened. It had lain in the course of poor Gwendolen's lot that her dependence on Deronda tended to rouse in him the enthusiasm of self-martyring pity rather than of personal love, and his less constrained tenderness flowed with the fuller stream toward an indwelling image in all things unlike Gwendolen. Still more, his relation to Mordecai had brought with it a new nearness to Myra, which was not the less agitating because there was no apparent change in his position toward her, and she had inevitably been bound up in all the thoughts that made him shrink from an issue disappointing to her brother. This process had not gone on unconsciously in Deronda. He was conscious of it, as we are of some covetousness that it would be better to nullify by encouraging other thoughts than to give it the insistency of confession, even to ourselves.
But the jealous fire had leaped out at Hans's pretensions, and when his mother accused him of being in love with a Jewess, any evasion suddenly seemed an infidelity. His mother had compelled him to a decisive acknowledgment of his love, as Joseph Kalonymos had compelled him to a definite expression of his resolve. This new state of decision wrought on Deronda with a force which surprised even himself. There was a release of all the energy which had long been spent in self-checking and suppression because of doubtful conditions, and he was ready to laugh at his own impetuosity, when as he neared England on his way from Mainz, he felt the remaining distance more and more of an obstruction. It was as if he had found an added soul in finding his ancestry. His judgment no longer wandered in the mazes of impartial sympathy, but choosing, with that partiality which is man's best strength, the closer fellowship that makes sympathy practical, exchanging that bird's-eye reasonableness which soars to avoid preference and loses all sense of quality, for the generous reasonableness of drawing shoulder to shoulder with men of like inheritance. He wanted now to be again with Mordecai, to pour forth instead of restraining his feeling, to admit agreement and maintain dissent, and all the while to find Mirah's presence without the embarrassment of obviously seeking it, to see her in the light of a new possibility, to interpret her looks and words from a new starting point. He was not greatly alarmed about the effect of Hans's attentions, but he had a presentiment that her feeling toward himself had from the first lain in a channel from which it was not likely to be diverted into love. To astonish a woman by turning into her lover when she has been thinking of you merely as a Lord Chancellor is what a man naturally shrinks from. He is anxious to create an easier transition. What wonder that Deronda saw no other course than to go straight from the London railway station to the lodgings in that small square in Brompton? Every argument was in favor of his losing no time. He had promised to run down the next day to see Lady Mallinger at the Abbey, and it was already sunset. He wished to deposit the precious chest with Mordecai, who would study its contents, both in his absence and in company with him, and that he should pay this visit without pause would gratify Mordecai's heart. Hence, for other reasons, it gratified Deronda's heart. The strongest tendencies of his nature were rushing in one current: the fervent affectionateness which made him delight in meeting the wish of beings near to him, and the imaginative need of some far-reaching relation to make the horizon of his immediate daily acts. It has to be admitted that in this classical, romantic, world-historic position of his, bringing as it were from its hiding-place his hereditary armor, he wore—but so one must suppose did the most ancient heroes, whether Semitic or Japhetic—the summer costume of his contemporaries. He did not reflect that the drab tints were becoming to him, for he rarely went to the expense of such thinking, but his own depth of coloring, which made the becomingness, got an added radiance in the eyes, a fleeting and returning glow in the skin, as he entered the house wondering what exactly he should find. He made his entrance as noiseless as possible. It was the evening of that same afternoon on which Myra had had the interview with her father. Mordecai, penetrated by her grief and also the sad memories which the incident had awakened, had not resumed his task of sifting papers. Some of them had fallen scattered on the floor in the first moments of anxiety, and neither he nor Myra had thought of laying them in order again. They had sat perfectly still together, not knowing how long, while the clock ticked on the mantel-piece and the light was fading. Myra, unable to think of the food that she ought to have been taking, had not moved since she had thrown off her dust-cloak and sat down beside Mordecai with her hand in his, while he had lain his head backward, with closed eyes and difficult breathing, looking, Myra thought, as he would look when the soul within him could no longer live in its straitened home. The thought that his death might be near was continually visiting her when she saw his face in this way, without its vivid animation. And now to the rest of her grief was added the regret that she had been unable to control the violent outbursts which had shaken him. She sat watching him, her oval cheeks pallid,
her eyes with the sorrowful brilliancy left by young tears, her curls in as much disorder as a just awakened child's, watching that emaciated face, where it might have been imagined that a veil had been drawn, never to be lifted, as if it were her dead joy which had left her strong enough to live on in sorrow. And life at that moment stretched before Myra with more than a repetition of former sadness. The shadow of the father was there, and more than that, a double bereavement of one living as well as one dead. But now the door was opened, and while none entered, a well-known voice said, "Daniel Deronda, may he come in?" "Come, come," said Mordecai, immediately rising with an irradiated face and opened eyes, apparently as little surprised as if he had seen Deronda in the morning, and expected this evening visit, while Myra started up blushing with confused, half-alarmed expectation. Yet when Deronda entered, the sight of him was like the clearness after rain. No clouds to come could hinder the cherishing beam of that moment. As he held out his right hand to Myra, who was close to her brother's left, he laid his other hand on Mordecai's right shoulder, and stood so a moment, holding them both at once, uttering no word, but reading their faces, till he said anxiously to Myra, "Has anything happened? Any trouble?" "Talk not of trouble now," said Mordecai, saving her from the need to answer. "There is joy in your face. Let the joy be ours." Myra thought, "It is for something he cannot tell us." But they all sat down, Deronda drawing a chair close in front of Mordecai. "That is true," he said emphatically. "I have a joy which will remain to us even in the worst trouble. I did not tell you the reason of my journey abroad, Mordecai, because—never mind. I went to learn of my parentage. And you were right. I am a Jew." The two men clasped hands with a movement that seemed part of the flash from Mordecai's eyes and passed through Myra like an electric shock. But Deronda went on without pause, speaking from Mordecai's mind as much as from his own. "We have the same people. Our souls have the same vocation. We shall not be separated by life or by death." Mordecai's answer was uttered in Hebrew, and in no more than a loud whisper. It was in the liturgical words which express the religious bond, "Our God and the God of our fathers." The weight of feeling pressed too strongly on that ready-winged speech, which usually moved in quick adaptation to every stirring of his fervor. Myra fell on her knees by her brother's side, and looked at his now illuminated face, which had just before been so deathly. The action was an inevitable outlet of the violent reversal from despondency to a gladness which came over her as solemnly as if she had been beholding a religious rite. For the moment, she thought of the effect on her own life only through the effect on her brother. "And it is not only that I am a Jew," Deronda went on, enjoying one of those rare moments when our yearnings and our acts can be completely one, and the real we behold is our ideal good, "but I come of a strain that has ardently maintained the fellowship of our race, a line of Spanish Jews that bore many students and men of practical power. And I possess what will give us a sort of communion with them. My grandfather, Daniel Carisi, preserved manuscripts, family records stretching far back, in the hope that they would pass into the hands of his grandson. And now his hope is fulfilled, in spite of attempts to thwart it by hiding my parentage from me. I possess the chest containing them, with his own papers, and it is down below in this house. I mean to leave it with you, Mordecai, that you may help me to study the manuscripts. Some of them I can read easily enough, those in Spanish and Italian. Others are in Hebrew, and I think Arabic, but there seem to be Latin translations. I was only able to look at them cursorily while I stayed at Mainz. We will study them together." Deronda ended with that bright smile which, beaming out from the habitual gravity of his face, seemed a revelation, the reverse of the continual smile that discredits all expression. But when this happy glance passed from Mordecai to rest on Myra, it acted like a little too much sunshine and made her change her attitude. She had knelt under an impulse with which any personal embarrassment was incongruous, and especially any thoughts about how Mrs. Grandcourt might stand to this new aspect of things, thoughts which made her color under Deronda's glance, and rise to take her seat again in her usual posture of crossed hands and feet, with the effort to look as quiet as possible. Deronda, equally sensitive, imagined that the feeling of which he was conscious had entered too much into his eyes and had been repugnant to her. He was ready enough to believe that any unexpected manifestation might spoil her feeling toward him, and then his precious relation to brother and sister would be marred. If Myra could have no love for him, any advances of love on his part would make her wretched in that continual contact with him which would remain inevitable. While such feelings were pulsating quickly in Deronda and Myra, Mordecai, seeing nothing in his friend's presence and words but a blessed fulfillment, was already speaking with his old sense of enlargement in utterance. "Daniel, from the first I have said to you, we know not all the pathways. Has there not been a meeting among them, as of the operations in one soul, where an idea being born and breathing draws the elements toward it, and is fed and glows? For all things are bound together in that omnipresence which is the place and habitation of the world, and events are of a glass, wherethrough our eyes see some of the pathways. And if it seems that the erring and unloving wills of men have helped to prepare you, as Moses was prepared, to serve your people the better, that depends on another order than the law which must guide our footsteps. For the evil will of man makes not a people's good except by stirring the righteous will of man. And beneath all the clouds with which our thought encompasses the eternal, this is clear, that a people can be blessed only by having counselors and a multitude whose will moves in obedience to the laws of justice and love. For see now, it was your loving will that made a chief pathway and resisted the effect of evil. For by performing the duties of brotherhood to my sister, and seeking out her brother in the flesh, your soul has been prepared to receive with gladness this message of the eternal. Behold, the multitude of your brethren." "It is quite true that you and Myra have been my teachers," said Deronda. "If this revelation had been made to me before I knew you both, I think my mind would have rebelled against it. Perhaps I should have felt then, if I could have chosen, I would have not been a Jew. What I feel now is, that my whole being is a consent to the fact. But it has been the gradual accord between your mind and mine which has brought about that full consent." At the moment Deronda was speaking, that first evening in the bookshop was vividly in his remembrance, with all the struggling aloofness he had then felt from Mordecai's prophetic confidence. It was his nature to delight in satisfying to the utmost the eagerly expectant soul, which seemed to be looking out from the face before him, like the long-enduring watcher who at last sees the mountain signal flame. And he went on with fuller fervor. "It is through your inspiration that I have discerned what may be my life's task. It is you who have given shape to what I believe was an inherited yearning, the effect of brooding, passionate thoughts in many ancestors, thoughts that seem to have been intensely present in my grandfather. Suppose the stolen offspring of some mountain tribe brought up in the city of the plain, or one with an inherited genius for painting and born blind, the ancestral life would lie within them as a dim longing for unknown objects and sensations, and the spell-bound habit of their inherited frames would be like a cunningly wrought musical instrument, never played on, but quivering throughout in uneasy, mysterious meanings of its intricate structure, that under the right touch gives music. Something like that, I think, has been my experience. Since I began to read and know, I have always longed for some ideal task in which I might feel myself the heart and brain of a multitude, some social captainship
which would come to me as a duty, and not be striven for as a personal prize. You have raised the image of such a task for me, to bind our race together in spite of heresy. You have said to me, our religion united us before it divided us. It made us a people before it made Rabbinites and Karaites. I mean to try what can be done with that union. I mean to work in your spirit. Failure will not be ignoble, but it would be ignoble for me not to try. Even as my brother that fed at the breasts of my mother, said Mordecai, falling back in his chair with a look of exultant repose as after some finished labor. To estimate the effect of this ardent outpouring from Deronda, we must remember his former reserve, his careful avoidance of premature assent or delusive encouragement, which gave to this decided pledge of himself a sacramental solemnity, both for his own mind and Mordecai's. On Myra the effect was equally strong, though with a difference. She felt a surprise which had no place in her brother's mind, at Deronda's suddenly revealed sense of nearness to them. There seemed to be a breaking of day around her which might show her other facts, unlike her forebodings in the darkness. But after a moment's silence Mordecai spoke again. "It has begun already, the marriage of our souls. It waits but the passing away of this body, and then they who are betrothed shall unite in a stricter bond, and what is mine shall be thine. Call nothing mine that I have written, Daniel, for though our masters delivered rightly that everything should be quoted in the name of him that said it, and their rule is good, yet it does not exclude the willing marriage which melts soul into soul, and makes thought fuller as the clear waters are made fuller, where the fullness is inseparable and the clearness is inseparable. For I have judged what I have written, and I desire the body that gave my thought to pass away as this fleshly body will pass. But let the thought be born again from our fuller soul, which shall be called yours." "You must not ask me to promise that," said Deronda, smiling. "I must be convinced first of special reasons for it in the writings themselves, and I am too backward a pupil yet. That blent transmission must go on without any choice of ours, but what we can't hinder must not make our rule for what we ought to choose. I think our duty is faithful tradition where we can attain it, and so you would insist for any one but yourself. Don't ask me to deny my spiritual parentage, when I am finding the clue of my life in the recognition of natural parentage." "I will ask for no promise till you see the reason," said Mordecai. "You have said the truth. I would obey the Master's rule for another. But for years my hope, nay, my confidence has been, not that the imperfect image of my thought, which is an ill-shaped work of the youthful carver who has seen a heavenly pattern and trembles in imitating the vision, not that this should live, but that my vision and passion should enter into yours, yea, into yours. For he whom I longed for afar, was he not you whom I discerned as mine when you came near? Nevertheless, you shall judge, for my soul is satisfied." Mordecai paused, and then began in a changed tone, reverting to previous suggestions from Deronda's disclosure. "What moved your parents?" But he immediately checked himself and added, "Nay, I ask not that you should tell me aught concerning others, unless it is your pleasure." "Sometime, gradually, you will know all," said Deronda. "But now tell me more about yourselves, and how the time has passed since I went away. I am sure there has been some trouble. Myra has been in distress about something." He looked at Myra, but she immediately turned to her brother, appealing to him to give the difficult answer. She hoped he would not think it necessary to tell Deronda the facts about her father on such an evening as this. Just when Deronda had brought himself so near and identified himself with her brother, it was cutting to her that he should hear of this disgrace clinging about them, which seemed to have become partly his. To relieve herself she rose to take up her hat and cloak, thinking she would go to her own room, Perhaps they would speak more easily when she had left them. But meanwhile Mordecai said, "To-day there has been a grief. A duty which seemed to have gone far into the distance has come back and turned its face upon us, and raised no gladness, has raised a dread that we must submit to. But for the moment we are delivered from any visible yoke. Let us defer speaking of it as if this evening which is deepening about us were the beginning of the festival in which we must offer the first fruits of our joy, and mingle no mourning with them." Deronda divined the hinted grief, and left it in silence, rising as he saw Myra rise, and saying to her, "Are you going? I must leave almost immediately, when I and Mrs. Adam have mounted the precious chest, and have delivered the key to Mordecai. No, Ezra. May I call him Ezra now? I have learned to think of him as Ezra since I have heard you call him so." "Please call him Ezra," said Myra faintly, feeling a new timidity under Deronda's glance and near presence. Was there really something different about him, or was the difference only in her feeling? The strangely various emotions of the last few hours had exhausted her. She was faint with fatigue and want of food. Deronda, observing her pallor and tremulousness, longed to show more feeling, but dared not. She put out her hand with an effort to smile, and then he opened the door for her. That was all. A man of refined pride shrinks from making a lover's approaches to a woman whose wealth or rank might make them appear presumptuous or low-motived. But Deronda was finding a more delicate difficulty in a position which, superficially taken, was the reverse of that, though to an ardent, reverential love, the loved woman has always a kind of wealth and rank which makes a man keenly susceptible about the aspect of his addresses. Deronda's difficulty was what any generous man might have felt in some degree, but it affected him peculiarly through his imaginative sympathy with a mind in which gratitude was strong. Myra, he knew, felt herself bound to him by deep obligations, which to her sensibilities might give every wish of his the aspect of a claim, and an inability to fulfill it would cause her a pain continually revived by their inevitable communion in care of Ezra. Here were fears not of pride only, but of extreme tenderness. Altogether, to have the character of a benefactor seemed to Deronda's anxiety an insurmountable obstacle to confessing himself a lover, unless in some inconceivable way it could be revealed to him that Myra's heart had accepted him beforehand. And the agitation on his own account, too, was not small. Even a man who has practiced himself in love-making till his own glibness has rendered him skeptical, may at last be overtaken by the lover's awe, may tremble, stammer, and show other signs of recovered sensibility no more in the range of his acquired talents than pins and needles after numbness. How much more may that energetic timidity possess a man whose inward history has cherished his susceptibilities instead of dulling them, and has kept all the language of passion fresh and rooted as the lovely leafage about the hillside spring. As for Myra, her dear head lay on its pillow that night, with its former suspicions thrown out of shape, but still present, like an ugly story which has been discredited, but not therefore dissipated. All that she was certain of about Deronda seemed to prove that he had no such fetters upon him as she had been allowing herself to believe in. His whole manner, as well as his words, implied that there were no hidden bonds remaining to have any effect in determining his future. But notwithstanding this plainly reasonable inference, uneasiness still clung about Myra's heart. Deronda was not to blame, but he had an importance for Mrs. Grandcourt which must give her some hold on him. And the thought of any close confidence between them stirred the little biting snake that had long lain curled and harmless in Myra's gentle bosom. But did she this evening feel as completely as before that her jealousy was no less remote from any possibility for herself personally than if her human soul had been lodged in the body of a fawn that Deronda had saved from the archers? Hardly. Something indefinable had happened and made a difference. the soft warm rain of blossoms which had fallen just where she was, did it really come because she was there? What spirit was there among the boughs? End of chapter 63.
This recording is in the public domain. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 64. Questa montagna è tale che sempre al cominciar di sotto aggrave e quanto più va su e men fa male. Dante, Il Purgatorio. It was not many days after her mother's arrival that Gwendolen would consent to remain at Genoa. Her desire to get away from that gem of the sea helped to rally her strength and courage. For what place, though it were the flowery vale of Enna, may not the inward sense turn into a circle of punishment, where the flowers are no better than a crop of flame tongues burning the soles of our feet? "I shall never like to see the Mediterranean again," said Gwendolen to her mother, who thought that she quite understood her child's feeling, even in her tacit prohibition of any express reference to her late husband. Mrs. Davilow, indeed, though compelled formally to regard this time as one of severe calamity, was virtually enjoying her life more than she had ever done since her daughter's marriage. It seemed that her darling was brought back to her not merely with all the old affection, but with a conscious cherishing of her mother's nearness, such as we give to a possession that we have been on the brink of losing. "Are you there, mamma?" cried Gwendolen in the middle of the night. A bed had been made for her mother in the same room with hers, very much as she would have done in her early girlhood, if she had felt frightened in lying awake. "Yes, dear. Can I do anything for you?" "No, thank you. Only I like so to know you are there. Do you mind my waking you?" This question would hardly have been in Gwendolen's in her early girlhood. "I was not asleep, darling." "It seemed not real that you were with me. I wanted to make it real. I can bear things if you are with me. But you must not lie awake, anxious about me. You must be happy now. You must let me make you happy now at last. Else what shall I do?" "God bless you, dear. I have the best happiness I can have when you make much of me." But the next night, hearing that she was sighing and restless, Mrs. Davilow said, "Let me give you your sleeping draught, Gwendolen." "No, mamma, thank you. I don't want to sleep." "It would be so good for you to sleep more, my darling." "Don't say what would be good for me, mamma," Gwendolen answered impetuously. "You don't know what would be good for me. You and my uncle must not contradict me and tell me anything is good for me when I feel it is not good." Mrs. Davilow was silent, not wondering that the poor child was irritable. Presently Gwendolen said, "I was always naughty to you, mamma." "No, dear, no." "Yes, I was," said Gwendolen insistently. "It is because I was always wicked that I am miserable now." She burst into sobs and cries. The determination to be silent about all the facts of her married life and its close reacted in these escapes of enigmatic excitement. But dim lights of interpretation were breaking on the mother's mind through the information that came from Sir Hugo to Mr. Gascoigne, and, with some omissions, from Mr. Gascoigne to herself. The good-natured baronet, while he was attending to all decent measures in relation to his nephew's death and the possible washing ashore of the body, thought it the kindest thing he could do to use his present friendly intercourse with the rector as an opportunity for communicating with him, in the mildest way, the purport of Grandcourt's will, so as to save him the additional shock that would be in store for him if he carried his illusions all the way home.
Perhaps Sir Hugo would have been communicable enough without that kind of motive, but he really felt the motive. He broke the unpleasant news to the rector by degrees. At first he only implied his fear that the widow was not so splendidly provided for as Mr. Gascoigne, nay, as the baronet himself had expected; and only at last, after some previous vague reference to large claims on Grandcourt, he disclosed the prior relations which, in the unfortunate absence of a legitimate heir, had determined all the splendor in another direction. The rector was deeply hurt, and remembered, more vividly than he had ever done before, how offensively proud and repelling the manners of the deceased had been toward him, remembered also that he himself, in that interesting period just before the arrival of the new occupant at Diplow, had received hints of former entangling dissipations, and an undue addiction to pleasure, though he had not foreseen that the pleasure which had probably, so to speak, been swept into private rubbish heaps, would ever present itself as an array of live caterpillars disastrous to the green meat of respectable people. But he did not make these retrospective thoughts audible to Sir Hugo, or lower himself by expressing any indignation on merely personal grounds, but behaved like a man of the world who had become a conscientious clergyman. His first remark was, "When a young man makes his will in health, he usually counts on living a long while. Probably Mr. Grandcourt did not believe that this would ever have its present effect." After a moment he added, "The effect is painful in more ways than one. Female morality is likely to suffer from this marked advantage and prominence being given to illegitimate offspring." "Well, in point of fact," said Sir Hugo, in his comfortable way, "since the boy is there, this was really the best alternative for the disposal of the estates. Grandcourt had nobody nearer than his cousin, and it's a chilling thought that you go out of this life only for the benefit of a cousin. A man gets a little pleasure in making his will if it's for the good of his own curly heads, but it's a nuisance when you're giving the bequeathing to a used-up fellow like yourself, and one you don't care two straws for. It's the next worst thing to having only a life interest in your estates. No, I forgive Grandcourt for that part of his will. But between ourselves, what I don't forgive him for is the shabby way he has provided for your niece—our niece, I will say—no better a position than if she had been a doctor's widow. Nothing grates on me more than that posthumous grudgingness toward a wife. A man ought to have some pride and fondness for his widow. I should, I know. I take it as a test of a man that he feels the easier about his death when he can think of his wife and daughters being comfortable after it. I like that story of the fellows in the Crimean War, who were ready to go to the bottom of the sea if their widows were provided for." "It has certainly taken me by surprise," said Mr. Gascoigne, "all the more because, as the one who stood in the place of father to my niece, I had shown my reliance on Mr. Grandcourt's apparent liberality in money matters by making no claims for her beforehand. That seemed to me due to him under the circumstances. Probably you think me blamable." "Not blamable exactly. I respect a man for trusting another. But take my advice. If you marry another niece, though it may be to the Archbishop of Canterbury, bind him down. Your niece can't be married for the first time twice over, and if he's a good fellow he'll wish to be bound. But as to Mrs. Grandcourt, I can only say that I feel my relation to her all the nearer because I think that she has not been well treated, and I hope you will urge her to rely on me as a friend." Thus spake the chivalrous Sir Hugo, in his disgust at the young and beautiful widow of a Mallinger Grandcourt being left with only 2,000 a year and a house in a coal-mining district. To the rector that income naturally appeared less shabby and less accompanied with mortifying privations. But in this conversation he had devoured a much keener sense than the baronet's of the humiliation cast over his niece, and also over her nearest friends, by the conspicuous publishing of her husband's relation to Mrs. Glasher. And like all men who are good husbands and fathers, he felt the humiliation through the minds of the women who would be chiefly affected by it, so that the annoyance of first hearing the facts was far slighter than what he felt in communicating them to Mrs. Davilow, and in anticipating Gwendolen's feeling whenever her mother saw fit to tell her of them. For the good rector had an innocent conviction that his niece was unaware of Mrs. Glasher's existence, arguing with masculine soundness from what maidens and wives were likely to know, do, and suffer, and having had a most perfect observation of the particular maiden and wife in question. Not so Gwendolen's mother, who now thought that she saw an explanation of much that had been enigmatic in her child's conduct and words before and after her engagement, concluding that in some inconceivable way Gwendolen had been informed of this left-handed marriage and the existence of the children. She trusted to opportunities that would arise in moments of affectionate confidence before and during their journey to England, when she might gradually learn how far the actual state of things was clear to Gwendolen, and prepare her for anything that might be a disappointment. But she was spared from devices on the subject. "I hope you don't expect that I am going to be rich and grand, mamma," said Gwendolen, not long after the rector's communication. "Perhaps I shall have nothing at all." She was dressed, and had been sitting long in quiet meditation. Mrs. Davilow was startled, but said after a moment's reflection, "Oh, yes, dear, you will have something. Sir Hugo knows all about the will." "That will not decide," said Gwendolen abruptly. "Surely, dear. Sir Hugo says you are to have 2,000 a year, and the house at Gadsmere." "What I have will depend on what I accept," said Gwendolen. "You and my uncle must not attempt to cross me and persuade me about this. I will do everything I can do to make you happy. But in anything about my husband I must not be interfered with. Is 800 a year enough for you, mamma?" "More than enough, dear. You must not think of giving me so much." Mrs. Davilow paused a little, and then said, "Do you know who is to have the estates and the rest of the money?" "Yes," said Gwendolen, waving her hand in dismissal of the subject. "I know everything. It is all perfectly right, and I wish never to have it mentioned." The mother was silent, looked away, and rose to fetch a fan screen, with a slight flush on her delicate cheeks. Wondering, imagining she did not like to meet her daughter's eyes, and sat down again under a sad constraint. What wretchedness her child had perhaps gone through, which yet must remain as it always had been, locked away from their mutual speech. But Gwendolen was watching her mother with that new divination which experience had given her, and in tender relenting at her own peremptoriness said, "Come and sit nearer to me, mamma, and don't be unhappy." Mrs. Davilow did as she was told, but bit her lips in the vain attempt to hinder smarting tears. Gwendolen leaned toward her caressingly and said, "I mean to be very wise. I do, really. And good. Oh, so good to you, dear, old, sweet mamma, you won't know me. Only you must not cry." The resolve that Gwendolen had in her mind was that she would ask Deronda whether she ought to accept any of her husband's money, whether she might accept what would enable her to provide for her mother. The poor thing felt strong enough to do anything that would give her a higher place in Deronda's mind. An invitation that Sir Hugo pressed on her with kind urgency was that she and Mrs. Davilow should go straight with him to Park Lane, and make his house their abode as long as mourning and other details needed attending to in London. Town, he insisted, was just then the most retired of places, and he proposed to exert himself at once in getting all articles belonging to Gwendolen away from the house in Grosvenor Square. No proposal could have suited her better than this of staying a little while in Park Lane. It would be easy for her there to have an interview with Deronda, if she only knew how to get a letter into his hands asking him to come to her. During the journey, Sir Hugo, having understood that she was acquainted with the purport of her husband's will, ventured to talk before her and to her about her future arrangements, referring here and there to mildly agreeable prospects as matters of course, and otherwise shedding a decorous cheerfulness over her widowed position. It seemed to him really the more graceful course for a widow to recover her spirits on finding that her husband had not dealt as handsomely by her as he might have done. It was the testator's fault if he compromised all her grief at his departure by giving a testamentary reason for it, so that she might be supposed to look sad, not because he had left her, but because he had left her poor. The baronet, having his kindliness doubly fanned by the favorable wind on his fortunes and by compassion for Gwendolen, had become quite fatherly in his behavior to her, called her my dear, and in mentioning Gadsmere to Mr. Gascoigne, with its various advantages and disadvantages, spoke of what we might do to make the best of that property. Gwendolen sat by in pale silence while Sir Hugo, with his face turned toward Mrs. Davilow or Mr. Gascoigne, conjectured that Mrs. Grandcourt might perhaps prefer letting Gadsmere to residing there during any part of the year, in which case he thought that it might be leased on capital terms to one of the fellows engaged with the coal. Sir Hugo had seen enough of the place to know that it was as comfortable and picturesque a box as any man need desire, providing his desires were circumscribed within a coal area. "I shouldn't mind about the soot myself," said the baronet, with that dispassionateness which belongs to the potential mood. "Nothing is more healthy, and if one's business lay there, Gadsmere would be a paradise. It makes quite a feature in Scrogg's History of the County, with the little tower and the fine piece of water, the prettiest print in the book." "A more important place than Offendene, I suppose?" said Mr. Gascoigne. "Much," said the baronet, decisively. "I was there with my poor brother. It is more than a quarter of a century ago, but I remember it very well. The rooms may not be larger, but the grounds are on a different scale." "Our poor dear Offendene is empty after all," said Mrs. Davilow. "When it came to the point, Mr. Haynes declared off, and there has been no one to take it since. I might as well have accepted Lord Brackenshaw's kind offer that I should remain in it another year rent free, for I should have kept the place aired and warmed." "I hope you've something snug instead," said Sir Hugo. "A little too snug," said Mr. Gascoigne, smiling at his sister-in-law. "You are rather thick upon the ground." Gwendolen had turned with a changed glance when her mother spoke of Offendene being empty. This conversation passed during one of the long unaccountable pauses often experienced in foreign trains at some country station. There was a dreamy, sunny stillness over the hedgeless fields stretching to the boundary of poplars, and to Gwendolen the talk within the carriage seemed only to make the dreamland larger with an indistinct region of coal pits, and a purgatorial Gadsmere which she would never visit, till at her mother's words this mingled dozing view seemed to dissolve and give way to a more wakeful vision of Offendene and Pennicote under their cooler lights. She saw the gray shoulders of the downs, the cattle-speckled fields, the shadowy plantations with rutted lanes where the barked timber lay for a wayside seat, the neatly clipped hedges on the road from the parsonage to Offendene, the avenue where she was gradually discerned from the window, the hall door opening, and her mother or one of the troublesome sisters coming out to meet her. All that brief experience of a quiet home which had once seemed a dullness to be fled from, now came back to her as a restful escape, a station where she found the breath of morning and the unreproaching voice of birds after following a lure through a long satanic masquerade, which she had entered on with an intoxicated belief in its disguises, and had seen the end of in shrieking fear lest she herself had become one of the evil spirits who were dropping their human mummery and hissing around her with serpent tongues. In this way Gwendolen's mind paused over Offendene and made it the scene of many thoughts. But she gave no further outward sign of interest in this conversation, any more than in Sir Hugo's opinion on the telegraphic cable or her uncle's views of the church rate abolition bill. What subjects will not our talk embrace in leisurely day journeying from Genoa to London? Even strangers, after glancing from China to Peru and opening their mental stores with a liberality threatening a mutual impression of poverty on any future meeting, are liable to become excessively confidential. But the baronet and the rector were under a still stronger pressure toward cheerful communication. They were like acquaintances compelled to a long drive in a mourning coach, who, having first remarked that the occasion is a melancholy one, naturally proceed to enliven it by the most miscellaneous discourse. "I don't mind telling you," said Sir Hugo to the rector, in mentioning some private details, while the rector, without saying so, did not mind telling the baronet about his sons and the difficulty of placing them in the world. By the dint of discussing all persons and things within driving reach of Diplow, Sir Hugo got himself wrought to a pitch of interest in that former home, and of conviction that it was his pleasant duty to regain and strengthen his personal influence in the neighborhood, that made him declare his intention of taking his family to the place for a month or two before the autumn was over, and Mr. Gascoigne cordially rejoiced in that prospect. Altogether the journey was continued and ended with mutual liking between the male fellow-travelers. Meanwhile Gwendolen sat by like one who had visited the spirit world and was full to the lips of an unutterable experience that threw a strange unreality over all the talk she was hearing of her own and the world's business. And Mrs. Davilow was chiefly occupied in imagining what her daughter was feeling, and in wondering what was signified by her hinted doubt whether she would accept her husband's bequest. Gwendolen, in fact, had before her the unsealed wall of an immediate purpose shutting off every other resolution. How to scale the wall? She wanted again to see and consult Deronda, that she might secure herself against any act he would disapprove. Would her remorse have maintained its power within her, or would she have felt absolved by secrecy, if it had not been for that outer conscience which was made for her by Deronda? It is hard to say how much we could forgive ourselves if we were secure from judgment by another whose opinion is the breathing medium of all our joy, who brings to us with close pressure and immediate sequence that judgment of the invisible and universal which self-flattery and the world's tolerance would easily melt and disperse. In this way our brother may be in the stead of God to us, and in his opinion, which was pierced even to the joints and marrow, may be our virtue in the making. That mission of Deronda to Gwendolen had begun with what she had felt to be his judgment of her at the gaming table. He might easily have spoiled it. Much of our lives is spent in marring our own influence and turning others' belief in us into a widely concluding unbelief which they call knowledge of the world, while it is really disappointment in you or me. Deronda had not spoiled his mission. But Gwendolen had forgotten to ask him for his address in case she wanted to write, and her only way of reaching him was through Sir Hugo. She was not in the least blind to the construction that all witnesses might put on her giving signs of dependence on Deronda, and her seeking him more than he sought her. Grandcourt's rebukes had sufficiently enlightened her pride. But the force, the tenacity of her nature had thrown itself into that dependence, and she would no more let go her hold on Deronda's help, or deny herself the interview her soul needed, because of witnesses, than if she had been in prison in danger of being condemned to death. When she was in Park Lane, and knew that the baronet would be going down to the Abbey immediately, just to see his family for a couple of days, and then return to transact needful business for Gwendolen, she said to him without any air of hesitation while her mother was present, "Sir Hugo, I wish to see Mr. Deronda again as soon as possible. I don't know his address. Will you tell it me, or let him know that I want to see him?" A quick thought passed across Sir Hugo's face, but made no difference to the ease with which he said, "Upon my word, I don't know whether he's at his chambers or at the Abbey at this moment. But I'll make sure of him. I'll send a note now to his chambers telling him to come, and if he's at the Abbey I can give him your message and send him up at once. I am sure he will want to obey your wish," the baronet ended, with grave kindness, as if nothing could seem to him more in the appropriate course of things than that she should send such a message. But he was convinced that Gwendolen had a passionate attachment to Deronda, the seeds of which had been laid long ago, and his former suspicion now recurred to him with more strength than ever, that her feeling was likely to lead her into imprudences, in which kind-hearted Sir Hugo was determined to screen and defend her as far as lay in his power. To him it was as pretty a story as need be that this fine creature and his favorite Dan should have turned out to be formed for each other, and that the unsuitable husband should have made his exit in such excellent time. Sir Hugo liked that a charming woman should be made as happy as possible. In truth, what most vexed his mind in this matter at present was a doubt whether the too lofty and inscrutable Dan had not got some scheme or other in his head, which would prove to be dearer to him than the lovely Mrs. Grandcourt, and put that neatly prepared marriage with her out of the question. It was among the usual paradoxes of feeling that Sir Hugo, who had given his fatherly cautions to Deronda against too much tenderness in his relations with the bride, should now feel rather irritated against him by the suspicion that he had not fallen in love as he ought to have done. Of course all this thinking on Sir Hugo's part was eminently premature, only a fortnight or so after Grandcourt's death. But it is the trick of thinking to be either premature or behindhand. However, he sent the note to Deronda's chambers, and it found him there. End of chapter 64.
This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 65. O welcome, pure-eyed faith, white-handed hope, thou hovering angel girt with golden wings. Milton. Deronda did not obey Gwendolen's new summons without some agitation. Not his vanity, but his keen sympathy made him susceptible to the danger that another's heart might feel larger demands on him than he would be able to fulfill. And it was no longer a matter of argument with him, but of penetrating consciousness that Gwendolen's soul clung to his with a passionate need. We do not argue the existence of the anger or the scorn that thrills through us in a voice. We simply feel it, and it admits of no disproof. Deronda felt this woman's destiny hanging on his over a precipice of despair. Any one who knows him cannot wonder at his inward confession, that if all this had happened little more than a year ago, he would hardly have asked himself whether he loved her. The impetuous determining impulse which would have moved him would have been to save her from sorrow, to shelter her life forevermore from the dangers of loneliness, and carry out to the last the rescue he had begun in that monitory redemption of the necklace. But now love and duty had thrown other bonds around him, and that impulse could no longer determine his life. Still it was present in him as a compassionate yearning, a painful quivering at the very imagination of having again and again to meet the appeal of her eyes and words. The very strength of the bond, the certainty of the resolve that kept him asunder from her, made him gaze at her lot apart with a more aching pity. He awaited her coming in the back drawing-room, part of that white and crimson space where they had sat together at the musical party, where Gwendolen had said for the first time that her lot depended on his not forsaking her, and her appeal had seemed to melt into the melodic cry, "Per pietà non dirmi addio." But the melody had come from Mirah's dear voice. Deronda walked about this room, which he had for years known by heart, with a strange sense of metamorphosis in his own life. The familiar objects around him, from Lady Mallinger's gently smiling portrait to the also human and urbane faces of the lions on the pilasters of the chimney-piece, seemed almost to belong to a previous state of existence, which he was revisiting in memory only, not in reality. So deep and transforming had been the impressions he had lately experienced, so new were the conditions under which he found himself in the house he had been accustomed to think of as a home, standing with his hat in his hand awaiting the entrance of a young creature whose life had also been undergoing a tragic transformation toward a wavering result, in which he felt with apprehensiveness that his own action was still bound up. But Gwendolen was come in, looking changed, not only by her mourning dress, but by a more satisfied quietude of expression than he had seen in her face at Genoa. Her satisfaction was that Deronda was there, but there was no smile between them as they met and clasped hands. Each was full of remembrance, full of anxious prevision. She said, "It was good of you to come. Let us sit down," immediately seating herself in the nearest chair. He placed himself opposite to her. "I begged you to come because I want you to tell me what I ought to do," she began at once. "Don't be afraid of telling me what you think is right, because it seems hard. I have made up my mind to do it. I was afraid once of being poor. I could not bear to think of being under other people, and that was why I did something—why I married. I have borne worse things now. I think I could bear to be poor, if you think I ought. Do you know about my husband's will?" "Yes, Sir Hugo told me," said Deronda, already guessing the question she had to ask. "Ought I to take anything he has left me? I will tell you what I have been thinking," said Gwendolen, with a more nervous energy. "Perhaps you may not quite know that I really did think a good deal about my mother when I married. I was selfish, but I did love her and feel about her poverty. And what comforted me most at first, when I was miserable, was her being better off because I had married. The thing that would be hardest to me now would be to see her in poverty again. And I have been thinking that if I took enough to provide for her, and no more, nothing for myself, it would not be wrong, for I was very precious to my mother, and he took me from her, and he meant—and if she had known—" Gwendolen broke off. She had been preparing herself for this interview by thinking of hardly anything else than this question of right toward her mother, but the question had carried with it thoughts and reasons which it was impossible for her to utter, and these perilous remembrances swarmed between her words, making her speech more and more agitated and tremulous. She looked down helplessly at her hands, now unladen of all rings except her wedding ring. "Do not hurt yourself by speaking of that," said Deronda, tenderly. "There is no need. The case is very simple. I think I can hardly judge wrongly about it. You consult me because I am the only person to whom you have confided the most painful part of your experience, and I can understand your scruples." He did not go on immediately, waiting for her to recover herself. The silence seemed to Gwendolen full of the tenderness that she heard in his voice, and she had courage to lift up her eyes and look at him as he said, "You are conscious of something which you feel to be a crime toward one who is dead. You think that you have forfeited all claim as a wife. You shrink from taking what was his. You want to keep yourself from profiting by his death. Your feeling even urges you to some self-punishment, some scourging of the self that disobeyed your better will, the will that struggled against temptation. I have known something of that myself. Do I understand you?" "Yes. At least, I want to be good, not like what I have been," said Gwendolen. "I will try to bear what you think I ought to bear. I have tried to tell you the worst about myself. What ought I to do?" "If no one but yourself were concerned in this question of income," said Deronda, "I should hardly dare to urge you against any remorseful prompting. But I take as a guide now your feeling about Mrs. Davilow, which seems to me quite just. I cannot think that your husband's dues even to yourself are nullified by any act you have committed. He voluntarily entered into your life, and affected its course in what is always the most momentous way. But setting that aside, it was due from him in his position that he should provide for your mother, and he of course understood that if this will took effect she would share the provision he had made for you." "She has had 800 a year. What I thought of was to take that and leave the rest," said Gwendolen. She had been so long inwardly arguing for this as a permission, that her mind could not at once take another attitude. "I think it is not your duty to fix a limit in that way," said Deronda. "You would be making a painful enigma for Mrs. Davilow,
An income from which you shut yourself out must be embittered to her, and your own course would become too difficult. We agreed at Genoa that the burden on your conscience is one what no one ought to be admitted to the knowledge of. The future beneficence of your life will be best furthered by your saving all others from the pain of that knowledge. In my opinion, you ought simply to abide by the provisions of your husband's will, and let your remorse tell only on the use that you will make of your monetary independence." In uttering the last sentence, Deronda automatically took up his hat, which he had laid on the floor beside him. Gwendolen, sensitive to his slightest movement, felt her heart giving a great leap as if it too had a consciousness of its own, and would hinder him from going. In the same moment she rose from her chair, unable to reflect that the movement was an acceptance of his apparent intention to leave her, and Deronda, of course, also rose, advancing a little. "I will do what you tell me," said Gwendolen hurriedly. "But what else shall I do?" No other than these simple words were possible to her, and even these were too much for her in a state of emotion where her proud secrecy was disenthroned. As the childlike sentences fell from her lips, they reacted on her like a picture of her own helplessness, and she could not check the sob which sent the large tears to her eyes. Deronda, too, felt a crushing pain, but imminent consequences were visible to him, and urged him to the utmost exertion of conscience. When she had pressed her tears away, he said, in a gently questioning tone, "You will probably be soon going with Mrs. Davilow into the country?" "Yes, in a week or 10 days." Gwendolen waited an instant, turning her eyes vaguely toward the window as if looking at some imagined prospect. "I want to be kind to them all. They can be happier than I can. Is that the best I can do?" "I think so. It is a duty that cannot be doubtful," said Deronda. He paused a little between his sentences, feeling a weight of anxiety on all his words. "Other duties will spring from it. Looking at your life as a debt may seem the dreariest view of things at a distance, but it cannot really be so. What makes life dreary is the want of motive. But once beginning to act with that penitential, loving purpose you have in your mind, there will be unexpected satisfactions. There will be newly opening needs, continually coming to carry you on from day to day. You will find your life growing like a plant." Gwendolen turned her eyes on him with the look of one athirst toward the sound of unseen waters. Deronda felt the look as if she had been stretching her arms toward him from a forsaken shore. His voice took an affectionate imploringness when he said, "This sorrow which has cut down to the root has come to you while you are so young. Try to think of it not as a spoiling of your life, but as a preparation for it. Let it be a preparation." Any one overhearing his tones would have thought he was entreating for his own happiness. "See, you have been saved from the worst evils that might have come from your marriage, which you feel was wrong. You have had a vision of injurious, selfish action, a vision of possible degradation. Think that a severe angel, seeing you along the road of error, grasped you by the wrist and showed you the horror of the life you must avoid. And it has come to you in your springtime. Think of it as a preparation. You can, you will be among the best of women, such as make others glad that they were born." The words were like the touch of a miraculous hand to Gwendolen. Mingled emotions streamed through her frame with a strength that seemed the beginning of a new existence, having some new power or other which stirred in her vaguely. So pregnant is the divine hope of moral recovery with the energy that fulfills it. So potent in us is the infused action of another soul before which we bow in complete love. But the new existence seemed inseparable from Deronda. The hope seemed to make his presence permanent. It was not her thought that he loved her and would cling to her. A thought would have tottered with improbability. It was her spiritual breath. For the first time since that terrible moment on the sea, a flush rose and spread over her cheek, brow, and neck, deepened an instant or two, and then gradually disappeared. She did not speak. Deronda advanced and put out his hand, saying, "I must not weary you." She was startled by the sense that he was going, and put her hand in his, still without speaking. "You look ill yet, unlike yourself," he added while he held her hand. "I can't sleep much," she answered, with some return of her dispirited manner. "Things repeat themselves in me so. They come back, they will all come back," she ended, shudderingly, a chill fear threatening her. "By degrees they will be less insistent," said Deronda. He could not drop her hand or move away from her abruptly. "Sir Hugo says he shall come to stay at Diplow," said Gwendolen, snatching at previously intended words which had slipped away from her. "You will come too?" "Probably," said Deronda; and then, feeling that the word was cold, he added, correctively, "Yes, I shall come," and then released her hand with the final friendly pressure of one who has virtually said good-bye. "And not again here, before I leave town?" said Gwendolen, with timid sadness, looking as pallid as ever. What could Deronda say? "If I can be of any use—if you wish me—certainly I will." "I must wish it," said Gwendolen, impetuously. "You know I must wish it. What strength have I? Who else is there?" Again a sob was rising. Deronda felt a pang which showed itself in his face. He looked miserable as he said, "I will certainly come." Gwendolen perceived the change in his face, but the intense relief of expecting him to come again could not give way to any other feeling, and there was a recovery of the inspired hope and courage in her. "Don't be unhappy about me," she said, in a tone of affectionate assurance. "I shall remember your words, every one of them. I shall remember what you believe about me. I shall try." She looked at him firmly and put out her hand again, as if she had forgotten what had passed since those words of his which she promised to remember. But there was no approach to a smile on her lips. She had never smiled since her husband's death. When she stood still and in silence, she looked like a melancholy statue of the Gwendolen whose laughter had once been so ready when others were grave. It is only by remembering the searching anguish which had changed the aspect of the world for her that we can understand her behavior to Deronda, the unreflecting openness, nay, the importunate pleading with which she expressed her dependence on him. Considerations such as would have filled the minds of indifferent spectators could not occur to her, any more than if flames had been mounting around her, and she had flung herself into his open arms and clung about his neck that he might carry her to safety. She identified him with the struggling regenerative process in her which had begun with his action. Is it any wonder that she saw her own necessity reflected in his feeling? She was in that state of unconscious reliance and expectation which is a common experience with us when we are preoccupied with our own trouble or our own purposes. We diffuse our feeling over others and count on their acting from our motives. Her imagination had not been turned to a future union with Deronda by any other than the spiritual tie which had been continually strengthening, but also it had not been turned toward a future separation from him. Love-making and marriage—how could they be the imagery in which poor Gwendolen's deepest attachment could spontaneously clothe itself? Mighty love had laid his hand upon her, but what had he demanded of her? Acceptance of rebuke, the hard task of self-change, confession, endurance. If she cried toward him, what then? She cried as the child cries whose little feet have fallen backward, cried to be taken by the hand lest she should lose herself. The cry pierced Deronda. What position could have been more difficult for a man full of tenderness, yet with clear foresight? He was the only creature who knew the real nature of Gwendolen's trouble. To withdraw himself from any appeal of hers would be to consign her to a dangerous loneliness. He could not reconcile himself to the cruelty of apparently rejecting her dependence on him, and yet in the nearer or farther distance he saw a coming wrench, which all present strengthening of their bond would make the harder. He was obliged to risk that. He went once and again to Park Lane before Gwendolen left, but their interviews were in the presence of Mrs. Davilow, and were therefore less agitating. Gwendolen, since she had determined to accept her income, had conceived a project which she liked to speak of. It was, to place her mother and sisters with herself in Offendene again, and, as she said, piece back her life unto that time when they first went there, and when everything was happiness about her, only she did not know it. The idea had been mentioned to Sir Hugo, who was going to exert himself about the letting of Gadsmere for a rent which would more than pay the rent of Offendene. All this was told to Deronda, who willingly dwelt on a subject that seemed to give some soothing occupation to Gwendolen. He said nothing, and she said nothing, of what chiefly occupied himself. Her mind was fixed on his coming to Diplow before the autumn was over, and she no more thought of the Lapidoths, the little Jewess and her brother, as likely to make a difference in her destiny, than of the fermenting political and social leaven which was making a difference in the history of the world. In fact, poor Gwendolen's memory had been stunned, and all outside the lava-lit track of her troubled conscience, and her effort to get deliverance from it, lay for her in dim forgetfulness. End of chapter 65. This recording is in the public domain.